Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our fourth webinar. My name is Carolyn Tricino. I'm the director of Poison Free Agoura, and we are thrilled to have Justin Brown, wildlife ecologist with the National Park Service, tell us a lot about how to coexist with coyotes. I'm going to let Justin go forward with his presentation now, and after he completes his presentation, we're going to answer the Q&A. So as you're thinking of questions, go ahead and chat those in and we'll get started.
Great, thanks, Carolyn. Thanks everybody for joining. So as Carolyn mentioned, my name is Justin Brown. I'm an ecologist with the National Park Service. I've been here at the Santa Monica Mountains for about 10 years at this point. Prior to coming here, I worked in Chicago on an urban coyote study. Part of my graduate work was looking at coyotes and how they were impacting geese populations and just how they were interacting with urban environments. But I've basically been doing wildlife work now for 20 plus years, with a lot of the time actually being spent working with coyotes. So hopefully I'll be able to provide you guys a lot of good information today. And as Carolyn mentioned, just put questions in the question and answer, and I'll do my best to answer them after my talk here. So I'm just going to start my talk off. So I give these talks not often, but often enough that I get a lot of different questions about coyotes and comments about coyotes. And so here's just some of the common ones that I'm going to try to address today through my talk. And so please, if you have others or if something branches off of here, please feel free to ask after the talk is over. So the first is, how big are coyotes? A lot of people think coyotes are the size of, say, German Shepherds, Rottweilers, those type of dogs. They're really not. The average coyote in Los Angeles is somewhere around 27 pounds. So they're not really that big. When you start thinking in terms of types of dogs, it's really smaller dogs, things like Whippets, Cocker Spaniels, that are in that same size class. However, that being said, obviously coyotes are much more physically fit than most of these other dogs are. They generally live a harder lifestyle, so they're just tougher than our domestic dogs. And so they might only be 27 pounds, yet they are a much tougher animal than, say, somebody's Cocker Spaniel. But they aren't very big, and that's always something to keep in mind. People generally think coyotes are a lot bigger than they really are. Next question is, how many coyotes generally occur in packs? Well, this can vary a lot depending on food resources, depending on where it's occurring, how much territory is available. But generally within a pack, there's a couple different classes of animals in the pack. So there's generally an alpha pair, which is the breeding pair of animals. And so that's usually the alpha male, alpha female. And then there'll be some younger animals that we call subordinates. And they're pretty much always the young from either the last year or the year before that haven't left the pack. And so they're still kind of hanging around. They're being helpers for raising the next litter. And then the next group that occurs in the pack are the young animals or the pups from that year. And that's really that's what makes up a pack. And so certain times of the year, there can be a lot more adult looking animals in the pack before some of those pups start dispersing. And so there could end up being, every once in a while I'll get a report of somebody seeing 10 or 11 coyotes. That's not common to see because coyotes, there may be 10 animals in an area. However, they hunt individually, generally, or as a pair. And so there's usually not many times you see a large number of animals all together at one time. However, it can occur because when the pups start getting up to that closer to like 80, 90% of their growth done, it can look like a lot of animals being together at one time. These type packs don't generally last very long because once the pups get to mostly adult size, they start getting kicked out and they start dispersing. And we generally call these animals transients. These are animals that have left their natal range and they're off looking for a mate of their own in their own territory. And they can bounce around for quite a while just looking for their own territory. And so a lot of times you'll hear about coyotes coming or living in an area and somebody will go through and remove a bunch. A lot of times there's so many transients out there looking for territories that those areas that we've removed coyotes from generally don't stay vacant very long because there's just so many animals bouncing around looking for a territory. And it's pretty common when these animals disperse out of their territory, out of their natal territory, they'll come back multiple times into their natal range and then leave again, bounce around for a while, then come back. And we really only started seeing this in the last bunch of years because technology got better. And so now we can put GPS collars on these animals versus having to go out and physically track them. When you physically track them, you lose them a lot of times when they disperse. You don't get to see where they go. They just kind of disappear on you. You spend days, weeks, months driving around looking for them. And maybe you get lucky, you find them. Maybe you just spent tons of time not finding anything, listening to static out of our receivers. But the nice thing is with these GPS collars, it's really kind of let us look at some of these younger animals and how they disperse out. I'm not going to talk a lot more about that today, but it's kind of an interesting thing where the wildlife field has gone and some of the questions we can answer nowadays. And typically when they're transients, they move over a much larger area than a resident animal does. Sometimes 2-3 times larger. Sometimes they're covering multiple states. There's definitely been reports of animals that have gone 2-3 states over. And so dispersal can mean drastically different things for different animals. One of the comments I get a lot are, coyotes are new here. I've lived here 30 years. I've never seen coyotes here before, which could be true. Maybe you haven't seen coyotes in your neighborhoods. However, I pretty much guarantee they've been around. If they haven't been right there at your house when you've been sleeping, they've been somewhere nearby. Coyotes have actually been here well before humans were here. Coyotes, actually, La Brea tar pits have identified coyotes as the third most common animal in the tar pits. And so they've really been here in prehistoric times. So they've been around a long time, and they were around when dire wolves were here, saber-toothed cats were here, as well as a lot of those other animals from those earlier time periods. So not just in the prehistoric times were they here, but they've also been here a lot during just the more recent past, say like 1920s, when things were very urbanized. I went digging recently for newspaper articles just because I get this a lot. People saying, oh, coyotes, they didn't live in the cities, they're new to LA. And so I kind of wanted to go and look to see, like, were there articles, were people dealing with coyotes back in the day? And I found quite a few articles. Here's just a few examples: 1920s, 1917, 1965. So going back over a variety of time periods, people dealing with coyotes taking their chickens or seeing them in some of the urban areas. The next article, this one I found interesting because this is a crazy story. Like, the people were chasing the coyote around down right next to downtown Los Angeles, what now we consider the Westlake neighborhood. There was a guy chasing in a limousine as well as multiple other cars right next to downtown LA, which here's a map of the locations they suggest. And so this is downtown Los Angeles right here. Obviously you can see Dodger Stadium and Legion Park. And so they were chasing this coyote between these two areas. And what I found super fascinating is about 6 years ago, I actually captured a coyote right here. And this is the points from that animal. So all these blue points are from C144. And I literally captured him right here in this area where this newspaper was talking about coyotes running through the streets and being chased by people almost 100 years before. And so I just found that kind of interesting and fascinating this occurred. So this map, there's obviously multiple colored points here. So there's different animals, and I'll talk more about some of these guys here in a minute. And so here's kind of a blown out map of, these were the first 3 animals I collared in the very urban areas of Los Angeles. And you can see it, C144, C145, and C146. And these guys are actually showing different levels of their status in the pack. So C145 was clearly the alpha male in his pack. He lived there. He actually still lives right there in that same area. I still get photos of him occasionally. And he's still there. His collar died years ago, but I still get reports because his collar, it malfunctioned, and so it never came off. But the nice part about that is I feel bad that he's still wearing the collar. Luckily, it's a smaller collar. But the nice thing is I still get reports of him. I've been able to track him over the years just because he still has his collar on. C144 is interesting because she's occurring in that area I was just saying from the news story 100 years before. But she kind of really concentrated her activities around a few little green spaces that occurred in here. but then would disperse out into the communities at night. And so she was really cool. I got to see her, tons of behaviors from her, follow around with my antenna at night around these urban areas, watching her interact with how when people were on the street versus when they weren't, when cats were out, when they interacted with cats, with skunks, other types of animals. And so she was great because I could observe her pretty much anytime I went on tractor, I would see her because she was just using such urban areas. But her story is interesting because she was captured there. We had her on the air for about a year. She was jumping back and forth over the 101 at times, which is, it's fascinating because we know we have issues with getting animals over the freeways more out by us. Yet here's this coyote in this incredibly urban area that's kind of figuring out ways to do it. Which down there, this animal's used to running on streets, running through neighborhoods, running in these very impacted areas. And so for her, it probably wasn't near the barrier as it is to our animals that live in more natural environments. She probably didn't mind running over bridges or running through pedestrian underpasses because she's just used to running on sidewalk, pavement, those type of things anyhow. But what's interesting about her, about the time her collar died, she actually did these few points you see way out here to the left side of the screen. She actually moved out there and then her collar malfunctioned. And that was the last we heard of her. I actually thought maybe she got struck by a car. But this was at the same time there had been several bites occurred in Elysian Park. And so actually they had came out and removed, I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but 9, 11 coyotes, something like that, out of Elysian Park. And this was the same time C-144 started to disperse and started showing a little bit more weird movements. And then her collar died. And then about 6 months later, we actually, Miguel Ordonez from the Natural History Museum got a photo of her in Elysian Park. And so, and then ever since then, we've gotten pretty regular sightings of her or photos from her. One of my volunteers that helped me on the SCAT project I'll be talking about later on, she's been instrumental in keeping me up to date on what that coyote's doing and where she's at. And it's just super fascinating for her to give up her territory and move into this area. She had pups over here in this very urban area. Like right after I captured her, she was lactating. And when I went and tracked her the first night, I saw 3 pups with her. And so she was able to reproduce in this very urban area, yet she still did prefer Elysian Park. It opened up and she moved into this much larger natural area. And so it's just one example of removing coyotes doesn't necessarily keep coyotes out. And so then I was talking about social status within the pack. And so C-146 is more of an example of a resident animal that starts to disperse. And so you can see up here in the north side of her range, she was really hanging along the LA River for, this is about a month and a half's worth of points, kind of just bouncing between these two, bouncing along the LA River right here. Then all of a sudden she started showing some weird movements, ended up coming clear down here along the LA River, bounced around down here, cut over to Elysian, crossed the freeway into Elysian a few times into the main body of Elysian, bounced back, came up, and then she ultimately ended up dispersing into C-144's range. The same time C-144 was dispersing out here. And so it was just a big turn of events, like what was going on with my collared coyotes. And I'm just very disappointed that collar died on C-144 because I think it'd been super fascinating to see how that all changed. But during this time, C-146 ended up going down to MacArthur Park and actually ended up drowning in their Park Lake. And so that's the risk for these dispersing animals, is that they don't know the environment. They're bouncing around. There's lots of changes for them. This is an animal that grew up on the LA River where it could go in and out of the water regularly. And then all suddenly ends up down in MacArthur Park where the walls of the lake are, I think they're all metal. There might be some concrete, but whatever. They're walls that go straight up and down 2 to 3 feet down to the water. And so once an animal gets in there, it's pretty hard for it to get back out. And so the coyote ended up drowning in the lake. And so it's a sad story, but this is kind of the fate. Like, these animals have a lot of pups, and a certain number of them just are not going to make it as they bounce around these urban or any environment for that matter. Here's a picture of C-144 at Elysian Park, hunting around in one of the park areas there. That photo's courtesy of my volunteer that was out there. Here's a photo of C-145. This is about 4 years after his collar died. We actually collared another animal in his pack. And while we were out tracking the other animal, we spotted him, and he was just laying here in this parking lot. We sat there and watched him for probably half an hour, maybe a little bit more. And if a person walked by, he'd kind of get up, interested in them. And then if they didn't show any movements to give him anything, he kind of lay back down until eventually he ended up following a person and walking off. But it seemed pretty clear that he was hanging out waiting for somebody to bring him food. And this is the kind of scenario we hate to see. We don't really want animals dependent upon us. Wildlife needs to be able to persist on their own. So we've collared coyotes in a lot of areas for multiple reasons. We collared them in downtown LA. Here you can see on the right side. And up here, this is closer to Pierce College, to kind of look at some of the urbanization issues and how animals are moving around some of these urban areas. We've also collared one in the Thousand Oaks area, which ended up being, this is an example of a dispersing animal. You can see it kind of bounced all over the place. And what's super interesting here, these yellows, so this yellow, green, and red are all the same animal. It's just the red polygon is basically the tightest group of 50% of the points that we could get. The yellow was 95% and the green was 100%, I believe, of the points. And so it kind of gives you a feel for what areas they kind of concentrated their use in. But what's interesting is you can see where this animal crossed the road, which was not too far from Liberty Canyon area where we're trying to get the wildlife overpass built. But this is just an example of a dispersing animal, like it's covering huge areas looking for its own range. And then we also collared coyotes, but also bobcats and lions to look at permeability across certain roadways. And so out between Moore Park and Ventura, we were looking at the 118 to try to identify where we could improve it so animals could get across the highway better. And then we also did something similar out on Highway 126. The cool thing about Highway 118 is we recently actually, a lot of the mitigation was put in place and it seems to be being incredibly effective. There's been a couple of news stories out recently. So if you're interested, I'm sure you can find those. Okay, so I know this graph's a little much here, but basically what you're looking at is each one of these two of these are an individual animal, and it's just based whether it's the core of its home range, which is the 50%, or if it was 99% of its home, 99% of its points, so most of its home range. And then each color is a different type of land use. And so basically what I want you to take from this is coyotes are pretty adaptable. Here, this is pretty much showing that coyotes will find a way to use almost any type of land use. Here you can see like the green's agricultural. C-131 was, most of his home range was in agricultural landscapes. Then you can look over here at C-135. This animal preferred undeveloped parks and natural open space, which is where most people think of coyotes, is living in these undeveloped areas. And then you can kind of get over here to say C-144, C-145. A lot of their territories are occurring in high density residentials. And so basically what this is showing is that animals are able to use coyotes are able to use a wide variety of landscapes, of land use areas. And so kind of just to beat that home a little bit more, we've actually been doing a camera study for a few years now, kind of following the LA River from downtown out into the Simi Hills, and just kind of looking to see urbanization and what animals are occurring across kind of an urbanized gradient. And we've looked at a bunch of the different animals, but the animal I'm going to particularly talk about today, are coyotes. That's really all I'm going to kind of talk about with this data. And so here's an example of our camera sites. The gray areas are obviously the more urban. The greenish colored areas are more natural type areas. And so this next map, the green dots are where we documented coyotes. This is only from the first 2 seasons of data, so 2 months worth of data. But it popped pretty clear that coyotes were pretty much occurring across the landscape. And many of these red sites, I think our cameras just didn't pick coyotes up because things just weren't quite right, because many of them since have picked up coyotes. There's very few sites out of these 32 sites we're monitoring where we at this point have not picked up coyotes. But whether it's urban or natural, they seem to occur in it. It doesn't seem to really affect them much. So to them, it's more about what resources are available to them versus what the land use looks like. I'm going a little long here, so I may go ahead and skip the slide, but basically it's just showing that coyotes, at this bottom of the graph is just showing the percent of undeveloped open space, and coyotes are occurring in pretty much all the different levels of development. Okay, so another comment I get a lot, people feel like coyotes are denning in their backyard. This could be true during certain times of the year. So coyotes typically breed January, February, and then they'll have pups typically late March, April. And while they have pups, coyotes commonly use dens, or not, they do use dens, up until the stage where their pups start becoming more mobile. Once their pups get, say, 30 to 40% grown, they really mostly quit using dens and they start hanging out in thick cover and just finding areas where they can kind of hide away versus being inside an actual den. And so if you're outside of this denning season, it's very unlikely that coyotes are actually in any sort of den. Sometimes denning season can expand a little bit outside of March and April, depending on where you're at in the country. But generally March, April is when a lot of the pups are born here in Southern California. Outside of pupping season, it's common for coyotes to actually move a lot. They don't typically come back to the same place and sleep there every night. They may come through there every day and every night looking for food or just covering their territory. So they cover their territory pretty frequently. Like they're covering their territory, keeping other coyotes out and just surveying their land. But they bounce around where they spend big amounts of time pretty regularly, and they don't just kind of always go back and sleep in the exact same spot. There's always examples of animals that do that, but it's more common that the coyotes kind of keep bouncing around and don't continue to return to the exact same spot. What do some of these den sites look in urban areas? And so this is an example of one that occurred in the Silver Lake neighborhood. The coyote actually denned underneath a deck. And this coyote actually was causing problems for these people's neighbors. The coyote was basically, anytime somebody walked by with a dog, the coyote was basically trying to get the dog away and escort the dog out of there pretty aggressively. And so they wanted the coyote to move on. And so what we recommended them doing is just putting a light underneath their deck. Just long enough to get the coyotes to be uncomfortable and move on. When you have coyotes occurring in your yard that you don't want, a lot of times it doesn't take that much to make them be like, okay, it's time for me to go. It can be simple as moving furniture, putting lights up in different places, just changing it on them, make them feel uncomfortable, like there's things changing around them. And a lot of times that can encourage them to move away. Other types of den sites. So the one on the top left here is kind of more typical. This would be like an excavated skunk den or maybe a ground squirrel den. The bottom left here is a coyote pup running into a tree den. I've seen a few tree dens in my time doing work, but not very many. There's generally, they're not the best at climbing trees, so they have to find them kind of low or trees that are sloped to be able to take advantage of a den in a tree. What's more common is finding them in things like these pipe culverts like you're seeing here on the lower right, or piles of garbage that are left around that they can dig under. Those aren't uncommon to see in many urban areas. So we know what their dens look like. What about their reproduction? Well, coyotes can have pretty large litters. However, typically I would say it's somewhere between 4 to 7. I would say not up to 9 isn't uncommon. But this litter you see here in the lower left, this was actually from Chicago when I was working there, but we actually got a den of 11 pups. So it can be they can have quite large litters and raise quite a few pups. And so that's why part of the reason coyotes are so capable of rebounding, even through removals and through all the things people have done to them over time. Coyotes have shown they can persist. And part of that is because they are adaptable in their litter sizes. If there's more food resources, they're capable of producing more pups. And so if you reduce coyote numbers, generally there's more food, or if we're providing food, they can also have larger litters. Okay, so talking about food, that's one of the big topics I was kind of interested in as I radio track some of these animals is what resources are these coyotes using in these urban areas? So we kind of have an idea of what kind of dens to look for. And so if people want to keep coyotes out of their yard during pupping season, you just need to make sure they can't get under decks. There's not places for them to hide under your house or under a shed. There's not a culvert that they can get into right there in your yard, those type things. And so dealing with dens is a little easier. But what other resources do they need? Well, food is obviously a super important resource for an animal to be able to persist in an urban area. And so we actually started a study looking at the diet of coyotes, and we used two different techniques. The first was scat analysis. Basically, we collected scat from around LA and Thousand Oaks area, and we used this to look at what coyotes were consuming. The nice thing about scat analysis is relatively cheap. It's non-invasive. We don't have to capture animals. We don't have to harass animals. We basically just go out and pick up their poop. It's high resolution in that when you look through the scat, you can identify what is in that scat generally. And so it's a little higher resolution than the other technique I'm going to talk about next. It's also good in that you know the time frame that scat came from. If you cleared all the scats and then you go back a month later and you pick up new scats, you know that that scat has been deposited in the last month. So it kind of gives us a snapshot. And also it's obviously from one animal versus being from multiple animals. But the problem with scat is you never know which animal deposited it. So it's more population level trends versus looking at an individual animal's diet. Where the next techniques we use is called stable isotope analysis. And it's basically just looking at stable isotopes that occur in tissue that is brought in from the food sources that they're eating. The bad thing about stable isotope analysis, it's kind of expensive. You're just running the samples, prepping the samples, getting them ready to go. Can be a little expensive. There is some level of animal handling required because you have to get either tissue, skin, fur, hair, or whiskers. We used whiskers for multiple reasons, which I'm not going to go on to because I don't have a lot of time left here. But it's low resolution because it's really just kind of giving you a broad picture of what they ate. You can't go in and be like, oh, they ate a gopher yesterday, they ate a squirrel the next day. It doesn't quite work that way. You're more looking for the composition of stable isotopes in the diet and then relating that to prey sources. And so it's more kind of looking at averages over time because those whiskers or hair grow slowly. And so you're kind of looking at it over an expanded period. And then it can also be, but the nice thing about stable isotopes is it can be very individual specific. So you can look at a particular animal versus scat where you don't know what animals you're looking at. So you might have more information about that animal. Was it a male? Was it a female? Was it young? Was it old? And so you can just kind of generally do a little bit more stuff with stable isotope analysis. Just so you have a feel of where scats were collected with some of the data we're talking. These are the sites that are around LA. Here's the sites around Thousand Oaks that we collected scat from. Monthly events where we would invite people in to help us dissect the scat. And here's just some photos from our scat dissection events. We'd always call them scat parties. Met some amazing people that really helped with these projects. This project would not have been possible without the help of all these folks. So here's the data from the project. So we kind of broke it up. We basically found that it's not, the site specific doesn't really give much more detail than looking at a broader level of suburban urban, so Thousand Oaks versus Los Angeles. And what's interesting when you look at Thousand Oaks, things like rabbits really pop. I mean, almost 50% of the scats we collected had rabbits in them, no matter what time of season it is. Where when you start getting over into anthropogenic food items or human-related food items, so things like ornamental fruits and seeds that we put in our yards, ornamental plants, domestic cats, trash, those kind of items, they still occur in these animals' diets. However, it's around 10%. Sorry, I keep changing slides here. It's somewhere 5–10% for these different items, except for ornamental fruits during the dry season. Obviously, that jumped up there quite high. And a lot of that's because of grapes. We saw a lot of grapes in the Thousand Oaks area that coyotes were eating. Where when you look down at the urban areas of Los Angeles, a lot less rabbits. I mean, you're talking 20% of the scats having some level of rabbit in it. Lower levels of squirrel, lower levels of pocket gophers. What's interesting is the much higher levels of invertebrates, which is interesting, and why that is, I have no idea. So I'd be interested if other folks have thoughts about why invertebrates may be more common. Things like reptiles, birds kind of occurred in both, not super high levels. I mean, birds obviously in the urban could be quite common, but the thing that really pops are these anthropogenic or human food related items. Things like domestic cats. I mean, up to 20, 22% of the diet or of the scats had domestic cat in them in these urban areas. We can't say if these are feral cats or if they're people's pet cats. We just know that they're consuming some level of domestic cats. And then things like trash are also quite common in these urban areas. And so you can see that they are in these urban areas. I think, to me, what this shows is that we are pretty responsible when we have coyote issues. It's really because in urban areas, it's because we are providing these food resources. We're attracting them into areas that they probably wouldn't be without us. Like if I go and drive around some of these areas where we did these scat collections, you don't see a lot of rabbits. You don't see a lot of squirrels. There's really not many prey sources there. And so the coyotes, they really are dependent. I don't want to say dependent. They're there because we are providing some level of food resources, whether it's incidental or on purpose. Either way, they're finding food resources that we're responsible for. So the stable isotope collection, these are carcasses or animals we captured that we collected a whisker from. And so you can kind of see it's kind of spread throughout the Los Angeles area here. So this graph basically, I think the quick thing to know about this graph is the dotted line going down the middle of the graph. That is the urban. Everything to the right of that is animals that are eating more anthropogenic food related items, and everything to the left of that are animals eating more natural based food items. And so the little black diamonds that you can see here, those animals, those are the urban animals. The gray squares are the suburban, and these little gray, light gray triangles are the rural animals. And all the rural animals are occurring to the left side, so they're eating a much more natural diet. The suburban animals, they're kind of occurring, a lot of them are right on the line. And so it's kind of a mixed bag if they're eating anthropogenic or natural food sources. And then when you look at the urban animals, a huge number of them are clearly consuming anthropogenic food sources. And so it basically comes down to stable isotope analysis really kind of supports what we found in the scat work. The problem with scat a lot of times is you underpredict highly digestible items, which are most human food and pet foods, because you can't identify it in the scat. And so it was important to do the stable isotope analysis just to kind of make sure we weren't missing any major trends, and to just kind of give us an idea. And through stable isotopes, the next graph I'm going to show, you can break down food items to some level, but it's not as precise as you can do with scat. And so what's interesting here is that the rural areas, you can kind of see they kind of have a varied diet overall throughout with all the different categories of foods that we had examples of. Cats, they were still consuming cats, but fairly low. And as you get more and more urban, so the suburban Thousand Oaks, stable isotope is showing a little bit higher cat consumption. And then when you look at urban Los Angeles, it's actually showing fairly high, not too far off from what we saw with the scat work. And so then also pet foods obviously popped in pretty high here on some of the stable isotope analysis as well. And so what this tells me is that people really do, if you don't want to have coyotes in your neighborhoods, it really comes up to you to make sure there's not cats in your feral cat colonies. Try to reduce those. Having feral cat colonies around can definitely have an impact on your pet cat. People that have pet cats that go in and out, like if you have a lot of cats around, coyotes learn how to feed on them. And leave pet foods out. That definitely attracts coyotes in. So many times as I drove around LA tracking my animals, I would see them feeding on pet food that people left out in the front of their house or off the side of their house for the cats or dogs. And if you want to know more about this diet study, we actually published it in PLOS One. And so please feel free to look up that paper. It's open source, so you should be able to get access to it if you're interested. Basically, what this work tells me, though, is that these urban coyotes are a lot like Wiley. They can eat almost anything. And so with that, obviously we see that cats are an important part of some of these urban coyotes' diet. So if you want to keep your pets safe, you need to make sure they stay indoors, or you keep them secure in some way. But it's not always just about protecting the cats. It's obviously cats are also predators. And we get so many photos of cats carrying birds, as you can see here in the top right, lizards in the top left, or small mammals in this bottom left photo. And so cats are predators as well. So they're being part of the ecosystem out there when you let them outside. The next photo I'm actually going to show is a coyote carrying a cat in its mouth. And so if you're not comfortable seeing that, you may want to turn your head or close your eyes for a second while I'm on this screen. And so cats, when they're out in the environment, they are also open to predation, as our diet work showed, and this photo clearly shows a coyote that has captured a cat and is eating it. And so when your cats are outdoors, they're just part of the environment. And so it's important, if you want to keep your pets safe, to keep them on a leash like these people did. This is a great example of a cat that's getting outdoors, getting what it needs outside, but yet it's still being protected. It's not being allowed to attack other wildlife, and it's protected from coyotes as well as cars and domestic dogs and all that kind of stuff. So I give kudos to these folks walking their cat. So coyotes can become pretty habituated pretty fast once people start feeding them. This coyote was actually in the Thousand Oaks area. This coyote would hang out in the parking lot every single day. We actually named him Rice and Beans because the first time we saw him, he was in there eating a big pile of rice and beans somebody dropped in the parking lot. But it got to where it didn't really care about people, it just walked right by them, but it was always looking for food in the parking lot. And so many people were feeding it, creating a bad situation. We got lucky, a bite never occurred here, but this is the kind of scenario that we worry about leading to those type scenarios. This coyote was getting very bold and just getting to where it was expecting food from people. Food, obviously, when we leave food out, it's not just affecting coyotes, it's squirrels and other animals are taking advantage as well. So just being around, I've seen lots of places like this where people are dumping food, I'm assuming for the wildlife. So one question I get, will coyotes attack humans? There's been 2 reported cases of humans killed by coyotes. The first was in 1981, a 3-year-old named Kelly Keene was killed in Los Angeles by coyotes. And then in 2009, Taylor Mitchell was killed by a pair of coyotes in Cape Breton National Park, Nova Scotia. And these are really the only 2 known humans killed by coyotes in recorded history. The Kelly Keene one, obviously, a child that's 3 years old, you have to be watching them just in general. So, I mean, coyotes, there are definitely bites that occur on younger children at times. So this is a sad event. So you always just got to be careful. But obviously, it's not just about coyotes, domestic dogs, people, other reasons you need to keep an eye on your children. The Taylor Mitchell story is actually pretty crazy. I actually got to go up there 2 years after this happened. They were starting a coyote study, and I got to go up and help trap kind of the first coyotes for that study and put collars on them. But basically, those coyotes up there are living a much rougher life. They're dealing with things like snowshoe hares that go through population cycles. And so sometimes there's just not much food resources around for the coyotes, so they can get pretty desperate. During the winter, these coyotes are taking down moose that get stuck in the snow. And so they're pretty tough. Where our coyotes here, they're generally a little bit smaller than these guys up in Nova Scotia, and they generally aren't taking down large animals. Our coyotes rarely even take deer. We really haven't documented many cases of deer being killed by coyotes. And we actually got a video the other day of we have a few collared deer in the park, and this deer was chasing a coyote. And we don't know why it was chasing it, but it was interesting to see this deer kind of going after this coyote. So obviously the biggest thing is people getting killed, which is luckily very rare, and I believe will stay very rare and uncommon. I mean, however, bites do occur. A study put out by Garrett and White, Stan Garrett's the lead of the Chicago Coyote Project I worked on. And it's one of the, if you want to know a lot more about urban coyotes, he has a website called Urban Coyote Research that covers tons of topics on coyotes, and he's really the expert. I mean, I'm just doing what I can do to kind of add, but he's got way more information. So please go to his website and look at what he's done. But in California, you can see from this graph, California by far has the most bites or attacks on humans. And a lot of this is here in Southern California. And why that's occurring, I can't answer that. The one thing I do see here that I didn't see as much in Chicago is I do see a lot of people feeding coyotes. It seems incredibly common here. Where during my time in Chicago, we knew it happened here or there, but it didn't seem that common. And through their diet work, they don't see that much human food in their coyotes. Where here, we're seeing huge amounts of human food that the coyotes are consuming. And so I believe a lot of this is tied to food resources. However, a lot of these attacks, they weren't able to say there was food nearby or that people were feeding. And so it's hard to know at this time what's leading to them. But my general belief is that there is food resources are an important part of it all. And you can see it's 142 attacks over about a 46-year time period. And this was from an extensive search of newspaper articles. And so I'm sure there are lots of other attacks that happened out here that they missed. Or they left out because there wasn't enough information in the newspaper article to really tie it to anything that they were looking at. But it's just good to note that there are other types of attacks that we need to be cautious with coyotes, but yet still be bold. Will they attack my pets? Yes, here's an example of a dog that got attacked by coyotes. Canids are generally just territorial. And so coyotes kill foxes, wolves kill coyotes. And so a lot of it's just that territorial nature that leads to a lot of these types of attacks. It's not a predatorial, it's more of a territorial. They generally don't eat the dogs when they kill them. At least we haven't seen it in their diet very often. How to avoid your dog getting attacked: keep them on leash, haze coyotes when you see them, and then make sure you secure food sources so that coyotes aren't being attracted or aren't viewing people as a potential food source. Things you should know to avoid conflict: don't feed coyotes. If you know neighbors are, ask them to stop or try to encourage people to not feed them. Pets should be kept indoors and supervised at all times. Just because you have a 6-foot fence, don't think your pets are safe. Coyotes can easily jump a 6-foot fence. You can put things on top of the fence. When they do jump a 6-foot fence, they have to, I've never seen them just leap over without touching the top. So if you can put something on the top of the fence that would stop, like a roller type thing, that could stop them from going over, or you need to make your fences taller. One thing with fencing, always look for holes at the bottom. More often than not, I see coyotes find a hole at the bottom of a fence and sneak through. They do that much more than they jump over fences. And so you can get rid of a lot of problems if you just go through and make sure you don't have holes at the bottom of your fence. Dogs that are under 30 pounds or smaller in stature generally are at more risk to coyote predation. Big dogs do get attacked occasionally. However, they're much less likely to be killed. If there's a den in the area, just avoid walking your dogs there. The adults can be pretty territorial and protective over their den sites. And so, and bringing a dog within that area elicits that territorial response from them pretty frequently. And so most of the cases I've gone out to deal with when it's dogs and coyote interactions happening, it's because there's a den somewhere in the area. Not 100%, but a lot of them. If you see a coyote somewhere you don't think belongs, scare them off. Be aggressive towards them. Try to get them to run away. Hazing techniques to try to scare the animals. Be aggressive, loud. You can have things like metal cans with coins in them. You can have things you can throw at them. You can spray them with a water hose if it's in your yard. Yell at them, wave your arms, get big. Just act aggressive. Let them know you're the boss. Don't let them think they're the boss. You can blow air horns at them to try to scare them. Be really loud with metal pots. But the biggest thing is you just need to have something with you that makes you feel comfortable, makes you feel more aggressive, and makes them be more something that you can kind of go at them with. One idea I like is even just an umbrella. something you can carry pretty easily. And if you have an issue, just pop it open. It makes a noise when it pops open, and it makes you look a lot bigger. And you can also kind of like jab it towards their direction just to make you seem more aggressive. And so those are kind of some of the techniques that we recommend. When you are hazing, make sure you try to keep eye contact with the animal. Make sure it knows that you're the boss. It's not, don't be all soft, like, go away, coyote, trying to hide behind a bush. Like, be aggressive. Let them see you. Let them know that you're not backing down from them. Raise your arms above your head, clap and yell. Step toward the animal while you're being loud and aggressive. Like, don't try to approach it, but just make sure that you're not fading away. You're being submissive. You want to be the aggressive one. You want them to know that you're the boss. Like I said before, with the tools, just have something you can be aggressive with, something you can throw at them. Don't worry about hitting these animals. They're pretty tough. I mean, if you're a Major League Baseball pitcher, sure, don't throw a baseball at them. But something like pine cones, you're not going to hurt them. They're very tough animals. So just go ahead and throw it at them. Be aggressive. Let them know you're the boss. And continue hazing until the animal's gone. You don't see it anymore. And if they stop and look at you, it doesn't mean that they're not going to continue to run from you if you keep being aggressive. It's not them turning. A lot of times they're just looking to identify the threat and see if you're still coming after them. We've tried extreme hazing, which is really tough. We went out, this is my wife actually, when I was in Chicago, we went out, there was a coyote coming out after dogs in a park. And so we actually took our dog, you can see here over on the left-hand side, which she listened to us well. She was very confident dog. And so we actually went out with her with our paintball gun and we tried to haze them. And every time I've tried this, it's never successful. They never show up. With that, I'll thank you for listening. I do have a couple more little slides after here, but I kind of wanted to give you this, and the next slides are more just kind of an update on a recent coyote issue we've had. But this photo is interesting because there was 5 coyotes up here, and this one skunk ran them off. And to me, that's an example of hazing. That skunk, he was aggressive. He wasn't letting the coyotes tell him what's up. He was the one leading the show. So just a quick update. So we captured an animal in January 2020 in one of our National Park Service sites, Chesborough. This animal was a resident male coyote, and it was super cool, kind of mostly hanging out in the park, as you'll see from this slide. So the colored polygons are parklands. The gray one is a landfill. And then obviously all this is urban residential type areas. And we recently found this animal had passed away. We got a mortality message. So their callers, when they don't move for 6 to 8 hours, will send us a message that the animal's died. And so then we'll go out and look for it. And so it sent me the message. I went out and looked for it. And I ended up finding the animal laying dead underneath an oak tree. We ended up sending this animal off for necropsy and finding that it had pretty significant levels of anticoagulants. And the necropsy came back that its cause of death was rodenticide poisoning or anticoagulant poisoning. And so we're still dealing with these issues of anticoagulants. And so it's very nice to see people like Carolyn taking up the fight to try to help reduce some of the issues around anticoagulants. It's not just coyotes, but we're seeing it in lions, bobcats. We've had major outbreaks of mange lately in the bobcats, which we tied to anticoagulants. So with that, I'll just finish on this last slide of a photo taken by Steve Winters when he was trying to get photos of P22 at the Hollywood sign. So with that, I can take any questions.
Thank you so much for that informative presentation. I learned a ton, and I'm sure I'm not alone in that. We do have some questions, and I can just read them off to you. We have one. You mentioned that you use volunteers to help with the various studies. How does a person sign up for that?
Yeah, so we have different projects. So like currently we use volunteers to help run trail cameras. We have several different projects doing that. And you can reach out to our volunteer coordinator at the park and they can put you in touch with the biologist that's doing that work. The lead volunteer coordinator for the park's name is Sarah Conan. And basically the email, you could email her at sarah_conan@nps.gov. and she should put you in contact with one of us, whoever has open volunteer positions at that point.
And here's another one. A question on the Nova Scotia situation. It was known to be a horrible pack of maybe hybrid wolves and coyotes. Was that the case that you're familiar with? Hybrid wolves?
So no, those were coyotes. They were not the coy wolves that everybody talks about. Not saying there probably was some level of wolf genetics, but it's not kind of those first generation coyote wolf that a lot of people think of as coy wolves. But the animals they're slightly bigger. Coyotes just generally get bigger as you kind of go north and east especially. So, but yeah, no, they weren't like a super aggressive. I mean, they do have lots of bites there, but I really relate it more to they're living in a tough environment with very few resources. And so they're doing their best to get by. And sometimes we end up putting ourselves in awkward situations with them.
Okay. I've heard hazing should not be done if you see a sick coyote. What should you do if you see one?
Depends on what type of sick you're talking about. If it's just an animal that, say, if it's not down and it's, I don't know, there's a lot, that questions can be kind of loaded depending on which way I go with it. But if it's really down, I would call animal control, have them come get it. If it's an animal that's kind of still up and moving, doing normal coyote things, I generally would just leave it alone because no one can capture it. Generally, there's no one that can put in that kind of effort it takes to catch coyotes, especially an injured one. You can also take them to places like rehabbers sometimes can help them. But yeah, generally I wouldn't try to harass them and scare them off if they're injured in some significant way. If it's an animal you see all the time and it's limping or whatever, I would still consider hazing that animal because you don't want it to get to where it's begging for food. Like it still needs to be able to survive on its own.
And are there any instances of successful domestication of coyotes?
Yes, it's generally not legal, but there are situations where people have brought them into captivity. There are things where people have bred them with domestic dogs, and so they have these coy dogs that they've raised. And so there are scenarios like that where they are, people have brought them somewhat into captivity. However, a lot of times those ones that have, as they get older, they're not good. Like I would not want to pet a coyote. I've been around coyotes a huge part of my life at this point, and they're sketchy. They're not, I wouldn't trust them like I trust my domestic dog. You're much better off to find a domestic dog.
Do coyotes play with their prey or kill them quickly?
I would say generally kill them quickly, but when they're learning to hunt, just like a lot of animals, there are times they definitely will play with their prey and try to catch it. I've never seen it to the level I've seen with like cats where they really kind of bat it around, let it run off, bat it around again. I've never really seen coyotes do that, but they definitely will kind of play a cat and mouse game with them a little bit and try to not necessarily like before they catch them, I guess is kind of more what I'm talking. I've never seen them just kind of like toss it around and play with it alive.
Do you have an approximate idea of how many coyotes there are in any particular area or range around Thousand Oaks?
No, that's a really hard number to get to because pack sizes can vary a lot, as well as territorial sizes. And so it's really hard to get at that number. And we can't tell individual coyotes apart for the most part. So a lot of the techniques we can use on things like bobcats that have spots, we just can't use on coyotes to try to estimate numbers. So we don't have a strong estimate for the number of coyotes around. But the one thing I would say about that is I would assume there's coyotes everywhere. Like there's probably not a spot where there's not a coyote occurring in terms of like a territory, there's an occupied territory. I should say there's not an unoccupied territory. Hopefully that makes sense.
And I'm getting a lot of questions on recording. Yes, we are recording this presentation, and I will notify everyone when the link is ready. I'm just going to do some editing on it. And let's see what else we have here. Can someone type Sarah's email in the chat? Not sure of the spelling. I can also send that email as well when I send the link to the presentation, if that works. I'll also send the National Park Service brochure on coyotes.
Great.
And are there many foxes in the Westlake Village area? Some people think they've seen some foxes.
So there's two different species of foxes. There's gray foxes and red foxes. Red foxes are very uncommon around our area. And so I would say no to the red fox generally. Gray foxes are definitely around. Depends where you're talking in the Westlake area. They seem to be doing okay in areas where there's thicker vegetation, and a little less common in places like some of the patches in the Thousand Oaks area. We've been working there with bobcats for a long time, and we rarely document a gray fox. But in the big blocks of natural habitat, places like Chesborough, there are gray foxes. And definitely in the Santa Monica Mountains, we have gray foxes.
And let's see, it looks like those are the questions that we had. I hope I did not miss it. Oh, here's a few more. Do you work with Wildlife Care of Southern California? They are doing a lot of work with coyotes with mange.
I have in the past. I actually haven't worked with them. They've had some turnover in their staffing, and I haven't worked with them recently.
And do coyotes howl after a kill, or what am I hearing at night?
It's not generally after a kill. It's more them just communicating amongst themselves. Generally, they don't want to give away that they have a food source. And so they don't really make, occasionally you might get some yipping out of young animals if they got a kill because they get overly excited. But most of the time they don't actually, the noise isn't around them actually getting food. It's more about just them communicating amongst themselves.
Yeah, there's a few questions in this. You know, what's going on when you hear the coyotes calling each other at night? We live near open space, often hear the coyotes yelping at night, which is loved. And is that them feeding or taking a census of the pack?
Yeah, I would say it's more a census of a pack and just telling other coyotes that their territory is taken. But it's amazing, like following these animals, like through urban areas, I would follow them and all of a sudden they would part ways. One would go one way, one go the other. And then a minute later, all of a sudden they find each other again and back together. So somehow they communicate through those verbal tones that I don't think we necessarily fully understand.
And then someone asked the question about foxes. Are they larger than coyotes, relatively the same size, or?
So gray foxes are a lot smaller. They're closer and they're just a tiny, tiny bit bigger than domestic cats. And gray foxes are actually one of my favorite species. So look up more about them. They're pretty cool. They're one of the few canids that can climb trees. And red foxes, they're closer in size to coyotes, but still smaller.
And then there's a question on NPS collecting information about rodenticide poisoning in coyotes. And if one is found, who would they call if they suspect rodenticide poisoning in a deceased coyote?
I would say reach out to our visitor center and they will contact us.
Okay.
They're generally the best ones at being able to track down one of the biologists. And we don't have resources to test all of them. But if it's in an area that we're doing stuff and we have resources at that time, we will test them. But even if we don't test them, a lot of times I will get them and necropsy them and try to identify the cause of death. But usually I can't say whether there's rodenticides or not. Every time we run a liver to test for rodenticides, it's somewhere around $200-ish. So we only do it on, we will do it on any animal that's collared, and then uncollared animals, we have to decide how vital it is.
Somebody was pretty surprised when they spotted a gray fox on the outdoor camera, and pretty surprised, only happened once. I had one, living on my property for about a month, and it was fascinating.
Yeah, I love those little guys. Like
I do too.
They are so cool.
Can you talk about the consequences of rodenticide? It's the food chain. I'll let you talk as well, but it's just the impact of rodenticides is devastating in the food chain and affecting people, pets, and urban wildlife.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we've seen it go clear up to the mountain lions. I mean, we're having lions die of it, and it's not just locally. I mean, throughout California, we're seeing issues with things like mountain lions that aren't generally out there killing mini ground squirrels. Like, they're generally going for bigger prey, and yet they're still dying from it. And the ones we could kind of track back their kills, a lot of times it's from mountain lions eating coyotes, and so it kind of moves up the food chain. But it obviously starts with the small mammals and kind of works its way up into the largest animals.
And if you ever want to talk to somebody or contact us at Poison Free Agoura, we also have Cities Against Rat Poison, and we're represented in several cities. Please contact us, and we're here to help in that area. I have to say one thing about C167. That is the coyote that was pictured on our advertisement. A beautiful coyote, and I saw him several times, so it's pretty devastating that this happened to C167. Those are the questions that we have, and we're at 6 o'clock now. So Justin, this was an amazing presentation, and we're very excited. All of you who joined us today, thank you so much for your support, and we're just thrilled to be offering these. If there's any other suggestions you have on things that we can bring and conversations about wildlife or anything about rodenticides as well, we are here for you. So have a wonderful evening, and thanks again, Justin.
Hey, Carolyn, don't forget to mention the bridge.
Aha! My acorn. Yes, don't forget Cougars and Crossing Week, August 9 to 16. There's also a special coexistent workshop and wildlife crossing open house. If you got the acorn, I don't know if you can see it here, but the July 29th acorn, you'll check out your social media, more information to follow. It's going to be a good time.